new survey from Gartner finds supply chain leaders focusing on resilience. To discuss it, I'm joined by Geraint John, Vice President Analyst with the Gartner Supply Chain Practice. Hello, Geraint. How are you?
Very well, Bob. Thank you, and appreciate you having me on today.
And thank you for taking the time. I really appreciate it. So this new survey on resilience, when we say that companies are investing in quote unquote resilience and agility, what do we mean by that? And within the next 2 years, I understand, what exactly are they doing to achieve that?
Yeah, so I think what we see is that the terms resilience and agility are often used together. They're often used interchangeably, and of course, there's some overlap. I think sort of in the study we did, we defined them slightly differently. So agility is really about kind of sensing and responding to unanticipated changes in demand or supply, and being able to do that kind of quickly and reliably without sacrificing cost or quality. Whereas resilience, is really the ability to kind of adapt to structural changes by modifying supply chain strategies, products, technologies. So essentially, agility is being able to act more rapidly in the short term in order to kind of continue to fulfill customer needs and orders. Whereas resilience is about kind of building in longer term capabilities into your supply chain network so that you're better able to handle disruptions, whatever the cause of those. So I think, neither of these concepts, of course, is new to supply chain leaders, but I think really they're sort of top of the agenda right now because the events of the last 3 years or so particularly with the US-China trade war, and then of course over the last 12 months with the pandemic as well. So what I can tell you is that pretty much every company that we've been talking to over the last few weeks for our latest supply chain top 25 has got agility or resilience or both of those things kind of on their current list of strategies and initiatives. So very much kind of top of the agenda right now.
What types of technology tools are they specifically adopting toward this end?
So the study that you mentioned, which was a study of just over 1,300 supply chain professionals, what that showed was that more than half said they were investing in enhanced planning systems, particularly those that it would include autonomous capabilities, harnessing artificial intelligence and so on. Also, kind of demand sensing tools. 2/3 also said they were investing in supply chain visibility solutions. So really trying to get an end-to-end view from the customer requirements on the one side right back through to supply availability. And that also includes renewed efforts to kind of try to map upstream supply chains more extensively. So not just your tier 1 suppliers, but potentially also tier 2, tier 3, and even in some cases further upstream. Mm-hmm. So those were kind of among the sort of the top ones. Also, we see more than 60% saying that they need better supply chain risk monitoring technology. So that could include things like logistics control towers. It could also include geographic visualization tools where you have kind of 24/7 alerts across your global network. Obviously, some of those solutions are beginning to kind of introduce predictive analytics to help you sort of get, anticipate and navigate around potential issues or disruptions before they can have a significant negative impact on you. And we also saw some signs of kind of more automation, whether it be on the warehouse floor, the factory floor. So that's particularly in situations where you may want to bring kind of manufacturing back onshore, for example, and you need to make it reduce that cost differential, make it more economically viable. Mm-hmm. And then finally, I guess, thinking about some of the briefings we've had for companies for the top 25 recently, they're talking about things like digital twins, network modeling, scenario planning, again, to sort of, help them kind of anticipate events and be able to make kind of changes more quickly, when they need to do that.
Are they finding value in artificial intelligence even at this early stage of its development?
Yeah, I think obviously there's a lot of buzz around AI in lots of different in lots of different areas, including the ones I've mentioned. I think from certainly from the kind of the predictive analytics side on the supply side. I think that it's very early days for that. We're beginning to see some of those capabilities introduced into some of, for example, supplier risk management solutions, but they're only really just beginning to come onto the market, to any great extent.
Mm-hmm. Is it completely a technology play, or are there other steps in terms of organizational or reorganization that companies are seeking beyond technology to become more resilient and agile?
Yeah, so I think obviously technology's got a very valuable role to play as an enabler, but I think we certainly see investment beyond technology when it comes to agility and resilience. So I think some of the more popular strategies from our study would be things like developing more collaborative relationships with customers and suppliers, diversifying the supply base, so kind of more dual or multi-sourcing, redesigning products to try and reduce the amount of complexity, increase the use of kind of standard components. Also kind of doing more supply chain segmentation work to really understand where you need greater agility, where you need greater resilience, and perhaps where you don't, because you clearly can't cover everything. In addition to that, I mean, we also see, around half of the sample of supply chain professionals that we surveyed said they're actively investing in or investigating, moving manufacturing to different countries or regions. Obviously, sort of moving out of China in some cases is a big theme, particularly because of the trade war. But also they tell us that they're looking at outsourcing more kind of manufacturing or logistics activities to external partners. They're also, of course, in some cases, investing in kind of extra inventory or safety stocks in order to have more of a buffer in the event of particular disruptions or risk events.
Yeah, that's a lesson that I think a lot of companies have learned during the pandemic, that the just-in-time inventory strategy may need to be tweaked a bit in order to become a little more resilient. And of course, as you mentioned, the reshoring possibilities, but you also indicate that it's mostly a question right now of thinking about it, of planning, as opposed to actually doing, because these things take a long time to realize. Is that in fact the case, that it's more of a thought process right now when it comes to relocating or reshoring or even creating more domestic manufacturing?
I would actually say we're seeing a lot of action. So yes, of course, there are some companies, some supply chain organizations that are sort of looking at those options. Some of those are going to be very much for the long term. They're going to require capital investment and so on. And in some cases they may be kind of irreversible shifts to the supply chain footprint. So of course there's still a lot of investigation work. But I think we've seen really since kind of the mid part of 2019, we've seen companies begin to actually make some of these structural changes. Whether it's kind of shifting elements of sourcing to alternative suppliers, whether it's kind of beginning to move some manufacturing from, say, China to Mexico, or indeed to other countries in the Asia Pacific region. So I think when I sort of first began looking at supply chain resilience sort of in early 2018, pretty much everybody was talking. A year on, and this is really even before the pandemic hit us, we saw a lot more firm action actually being taken. And I think the main reason for that, of course, is the sort of the extensive tariffs being imposed on some products, some raw materials, components, is actually causing companies to have to make decisions. Otherwise, they were facing tens, hundreds of millions of dollars of additional cost.
Yeah. Well, the implication is, in all that you just told me, is that companies have the money to do this, which is maybe a little surprising to me, given the struggles that so many companies are undergoing during the pandemic. Are there capital constraints, or are they simply prioritizing this to a point, saying we have to make these investments and this is where we're going to spend our money right now?
I think it's a mixed picture, Bob, to be honest. I mean, clearly it will depend on the kinds of strategies that they want to pursue, the financial position of the company. So yeah, I think I think one of the reasons, for example, we see more collaboration with customers and suppliers right at the top of the list in terms of strategies that are being invested in now, is that those are perhaps in some cases things you can do without necessarily spending a lot of money. I certainly think cost is a big consideration here. 6 out of 10 supply chain professionals told us that their supply chains up until this point have primarily been designed for cost efficiency, not kind of resilience and agility. And more than half say that balancing those different elements is a major barrier when it comes to greater resilience. 40% also say that the cost of things like qualifying additional suppliers, duplicate tooling, and so on is also going to be a challenge in their organization. So I think cost is definitely a big consideration, and many of the strategies I've mentioned have cost implications. Having said that, I think when we asked the question in our study about do you think greater resilience, greater agility is necessarily going to cost more money, actually our sample was sort of fairly evenly split. And I think another consideration here, of course, is that the cost of not being more resilient or more agile can actually outweigh the investment costs of those pursuing those measures can actually easily be outweighed by if you have to shut down production lines, for example, you're going to disappoint customers, you're potentially going to lose market share to competitors. So I think we see examples of that around at the moment. So it's really kind of this kind of balancing act, and I think that's really what supply chain organizations, supply chain leaders are going to have to grapple with over the next few months.
All the same, I'm hearing some pretty good news here in terms of companies getting more of an awareness, as you say, of the multi-tier nature of their supply chain and the need to prioritize agility and resilience at the same time. They're following the usual dictates of low cost. But in any case, Geraint John of Gartner, thanks very much for enlightening us on the contents of this survey. We get a real good sense of what companies are up to in turn going forward in terms of wanting to remain resilient. Thank you so much for being with me today. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome, Bob. Thanks for having me on.